Atlantis. For nearly 2,500 years, we've been told the same dismissive story. Plato invented it as a philosophical allegory, a fictional island designed to illustrate a moral point about the hubris of ancient civilizations. A fable, a myth, nothing more. But here's the problem. What if Plato wasn't making something up? What if he was recording something he'd actually learned from Egyptian sources, from knowledge passed down through his family connections and his travels? What if the real story isn't just a philosophical tale, but an actual historical event that someone powerful didn't want us to know about? At the heart of this mystery stands a troubling question. Why did Plato, one of the most brilliant minds in human history, a philosopher who valued truth above almost everything else, suddenly decide to invent an elaborate fictional island complete with detailed descriptions of its geography, technology, and eventual destruction? It doesn't make logical sense. Philosophers don't typically spend pages describing imaginary places with such specificity and urgency. Could it be that we've misunderstood what Plato was actually telling us? Could it be that mainstream academia has deliberately downplayed the possibility of Atlantis simply because acknowledging its reality would overturn everything we think we know about ancient history and human civilization? Because most of what we know about ancient civilizations is incomplete. Most of it lacks real archaeological evidence. And what if the story of Atlantis isn't a myth at all, but suppressed history? Here's where it gets strange. Rather than welcoming serious investigation into Atlantis, academia has treated it as something to dismiss outright, to mock, to relegate to the realm of pseudoscience and conspiracy theory. And that resistance itself is suspicious. Why would serious scholars fight so fiercely against investigating something if there's genuinely nothing there? Why shut down research at the very moment compelling archaeological evidence emerges? Is mainstream academia protecting the integrity of historical studies, or is it protecting entrenched narratives that would crumble if we dared to look more closely? Because most dismissals of Atlantis don't come with rigorous counter-arguments. They come with contemptuous dismissal, with circular reasoning that says Atlantis is fiction because scholars have decided it's fiction. The answers you're about to discover might just change everything we think we know about human history. When most of us think about Atlantis, we picture the dramatic accounts from Plato's dialogues. A sophisticated island civilization with advanced architecture, powerful military capabilities, and mysterious technology that made them formidable across the ancient world. We imagine it sank into the ocean in a single catastrophic event, taking with it knowledge and accomplishments we'll never fully understand. On the surface, this seems like a fantastical story, the kind of dramatic narrative you'd expect from mythology rather than historical record. But here's the thing. The closer you look at what Plato actually wrote and what archaeological evidence has since emerged, the less fictional this story becomes. Surprisingly, there's very real evidence suggesting that Atlantis wasn't Plato's invention at all, but rather an account of something that actually happened thousands of years ago. Could it be that we've fundamentally misunderstood what Plato was trying to tell us? Consider this. Plato didn't just casually mention Atlantis in a single brief reference. He devoted significant passages in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, to extremely detailed descriptions of the island's layout, its governmental structure, its military strength, and the specific timeline of its rise and fall. He mentioned it as historical fact, not metaphor. He attributed his knowledge to Solon, his ancestor, who supposedly learned about Atlantis from Egyptian priests during his travels. Now Solon was a real historical figure, a celebrated Athenian statesman and reformer. When Plato cited Solon as his source, he was anchoring his account to a credible, documented historical person. If Plato was simply inventing an allegory, why would he anchor it so firmly to historical sources and genealogical claims? Why embed it so deeply in what appears to be an actual historical account rather than clearly framing it as a thought experiment? Mainstream archaeology has consistently maintained that Plato invented Atlantis purely as a philosophical device to explore concepts of power and civilization's inevitable decline. Yet, unlike truly fictional tales, Plato never explicitly said the story was made up. He presented it as something real that he'd learned through legitimate historical channels. This distinction matters tremendously. Archaeologists sometimes reference Plato's writing as evidence of his philosophical intent, but they rarely address the most crucial question. Why would he construct an elaborate false genealogy and attribute knowledge to credible historical sources if he was simply making something up? Ancient writers understood credibility. They knew the difference between clearly marked fiction and reported fact. Plato chose to present Atlantis as fact. One of the most puzzling inconsistencies in how scholars dismiss Atlantis involves the very evidence that should make us take Plato seriously. Egyptian historical records, including temple inscriptions and papyri, contain references to a devastating catastrophe that destroyed a great civilization around 1600 BC. This timeline aligns remarkably with Plato's account of Atlantis's destruction. The Karnak inscriptions and other Egyptian texts describe the Day of Darkness, a period of climatic disruption and widespread destruction affecting Mediterranean civilizations. Egyptian priests, the very sources Plato claimed to have learned from, preserved records of tremendous upheaval, massive seismic activity, and the collapse of what they described as a powerful maritime empire. Yet when researchers point out these correlations, mainstream Egyptology dismisses them as coincidence. But how many coincidences does it take before we acknowledge we're looking at something real? The archaeological evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine Santorini, the volcanic island in the eastern Mediterranean that exploded around 1600 BC with such tremendous force that it may be the most catastrophic natural disaster in recorded human history. This eruption, the Minoan eruption, didn't just destroy Santorini itself. It generated massive tsunamis that devastated civilizations across the Mediterranean, caused climate disruptions that affected harvests thousands of miles away, and completely altered the balance of power in the ancient world. The Minoan civilization on Crete, which had developed sophisticated architecture, advanced maritime technology, and complex governmental systems, was essentially wiped out by the resulting environmental chaos. Now here's what's fascinating. The details of this Minoan civilization match remarkably well with Plato's description of Atlantis. Sophisticated architecture. The Minoans had palace complexes that rivaled anything built by later civilizations. Advanced technology. They possessed shipbuilding capabilities that made them the dominant naval power of their era. Powerful military presence. They controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. Technological innovations. They had advanced water management systems, sophisticated pottery, and engineering techniques that wouldn't be matched for centuries. And then suddenly they were gone, destroyed by geological catastrophe. Could Plato have been describing not a purely fictional island, but rather an actual historical civilization whose memory was preserved in Egyptian records and Greek oral tradition? Engineer and geologist researchers have documented the precise geological evidence of the Santorini eruption with remarkable detail. The explosion was so violent that it ejected roughly 100 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and debris into the atmosphere. The force was equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs detonating simultaneously. The resulting tsunami would have been hundreds of meters high when it struck nearby islands and coastlines. The eruption was so catastrophic that it literally collapsed the center of the island, creating the massive caldera that exists today, a sunken center visible as you approach Santorini by sea. Underwater surveys have revealed volcanic ash deposits, pumice stones scattered across the Mediterranean floor, and the actual caldera left behind by the explosion. The timeline is unmistakable. Around 1650 to 1600 BC, Santorini experienced a cataclysmic eruption that completely altered the Mediterranean world. The only question is whether this geological event corresponds to the historical memory Plato preserved as the story of Atlantis. Yet mainstream archaeology has resisted making this connection explicit, has refused to acknowledge that Atlantis might actually refer to the Minoan civilization destroyed by Santorini's eruption. Why, if this connection is supported by geological evidence, timeline correlations, and detailed historical parallels, shouldn't we be exploring it seriously rather than dismissing it outright? Could it be that accepting Atlantis as a real historical event would require rewriting how we understand ancient civilizations? Would it mean acknowledging gaps in our official historical timelines? Would it necessitate reconsidering what knowledge the ancients actually possessed about their own history? Beyond the Santorini evidence, other researchers have discovered intriguing underwater structures and geological formations that suggest intelligent activity in submerged regions where advanced civilizations might once have flourished. Off the coast of Santorini and other Mediterranean locations, sonar surveys and underwater archaeology have revealed anomalous formations that deserve closer investigation. Some of these features show evidence of deliberate construction, of architectural intention, yet they sit on the ocean floor at depths that suggest they've been submerged for thousands of years. If these are indeed artificial structures from an ancient civilization, they would fundamentally alter our understanding of how advanced ancient peoples were. But systematic exploration of these underwater sites faces numerous obstacles, funding challenges, and institutional resistance. Interestingly, when underwater archaeologists do manage to conduct expeditions to promising sites, they sometimes encounter unexpected bureaucratic interference. Permits are denied, access is restricted, and research findings that challenge conventional timelines face skepticism regardless of their rigor. Is this caution genuinely about preserving archaeological integrity, or could it be about protecting a particular version of history that too many powerful institutions have invested in promoting? If someone discovered definitive evidence that Atlantis was real, that sophisticated civilizations flourished thousands of years before we believe civilization was possible, that would ripple through academia, museums, textbooks, and national identities built on specific historical narratives. Consider the transportation question that has always puzzled historians. How did the Minoans and other ancient Mediterranean peoples possess such sophisticated seafaring capabilities? How did they establish trade networks spanning hundreds of miles across open ocean when historians insist they should have lacked the technology? Ships found in archaeological contexts from this era show advanced construction techniques, sophisticated navigation understanding, and sailing capabilities that seem too advanced for what we're told people of that time should have been able to build. Could these civilizations have possessed navigational knowledge or maritime technology that we haven't fully recognized? Could Atlantis have been a seafaring civilization so advanced that their techniques and achievements seemed almost magical to later peoples, eventually becoming legendary? The Minoans weren't the only sophisticated civilization flourishing during this era. Multiple cultures across the Mediterranean and beyond showed signs of contact, trade, and knowledge exchange that suggests a level of organized communication we don't typically attribute to the ancient world. Could there have been an even more advanced civilization, perhaps longer lived than the Minoans, that influenced multiple cultures across continents? Could Atlantis have been a broader phenomenon, not a single island, but a network of advanced settlements, a sophisticated maritime empire that coordinated activities across vast distances? Some researchers have proposed alternative locations for Atlantis beyond Santorini: the Atlantic coast of Spain and North Africa, where underwater shelves and submerged land formations hint at continuous human habitation in earlier periods. The island of Crete itself, which might have been partially submerged or significantly altered by the Santorini eruption. Even more distant possibilities like the Caribbean or the Mediterranean coast of the Middle East. Each location offers tantalizing hints, archaeological evidence of advanced settlements, mysterious underwater structures, geological evidence of catastrophic events, and historical accounts from various ancient cultures describing a lost civilization or a great flood. The commonality across these theories is striking. Cultures from different continents, with no documented contact, all preserve stories of a sophisticated civilization that was destroyed by water, by geological catastrophe, by divine punishment. The Egyptians preserved the story of the Day of Darkness and a great flood. The Hebrews recorded Noah's deluge with precise genealogical details. The Sumerians documented the Great Flood in their oldest texts, the Epic of Gilgamesh, treating it as historical fact. The Hopi of North America spoke of a world destroyed by water. Indigenous peoples of South America and Asia all maintained flood narratives. All preserved stories of a golden age that ended in sudden destruction. Could all of these accounts derive from a shared historical memory of the same cataclysmic event that destroyed Atlantis? Could they represent different cultural interpretations of a real historical disaster that affected human civilization globally? What Plato described in his account, a technologically advanced civilization, sophisticated governance structures, military prowess, eventual hubris leading to conflict and destruction, perfectly matches the pattern we see in the Minoan civilization. The detailed architectural descriptions in Plato's Critias dialogue match archaeological findings from Minoan palace sites. The governmental structure he described, with its 10 kings ruling different regions, parallels what we understand about Minoan political organization. The advanced construction techniques he attributed to Atlanteans match the engineering sophistication visible in surviving Minoan architecture and engineering projects, like aqueducts and port facilities. The correspondence is almost too detailed to be coincidence. Plato's descriptions of Atlantean palaces, fortifications, harbours, and water systems mirror what archaeologists have discovered in the ruins of Minoan civilization. Then there's the technology question that historians typically downplay. Plato described Atlanteans possessing power sources, mechanical devices, and engineering capabilities that seemed fantastical to later readers. But what if these weren't fantastical at all, but rather descriptions of technology the Minoans actually possessed, but which was lost after their civilization collapsed? Could they have had early forms of mechanical power, perhaps using volcanic heat or water pressure in ways we haven't fully reconstructed? The Minoans demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of hydraulics in their water systems. Could they have developed this further? Could they have possessed advanced mathematical and engineering knowledge that vanished when the civilization was destroyed? The loss of a single advanced civilization would represent not just the loss of lives and buildings, but the loss of generations of accumulated knowledge, technical understanding, and engineering expertise. When such civilizations collapse suddenly, as the Minoan civilization did, centuries of accumulated knowledge can disappear within a generation or two. Yet despite all this compelling evidence, despite the geological confirmation of a civilization-destroying catastrophe occurring exactly when Plato said it did, despite the cultural memory of Atlantis preserved across multiple continents in different forms, mainstream academia continues to insist that Atlantis was nothing but Platonic fiction. Why this stubborn resistance? Is the hesitation truly about academic rigor, or could it be about protecting professional reputations, institutional investments, in particular historical narratives, or even national pride in established academic traditions? If there is genuinely nothing extraordinary about Atlantis, then why such persistent caution about investigating further? Perhaps the answer is that accepting Atlantis as real would require acknowledging that human history is far stranger and more mysterious than we've been taught. It would mean admitting that our current understanding of ancient civilizations, their capabilities, their knowledge, and their technological sophistication is incomplete at best, fundamentally wrong at worst. It would require museums to revise their exhibits, textbooks to rewrite chapters, and academic careers built on certain historical timelines to be reconsidered. For many in the establishment, that's too high a price to pay. The mystery of Atlantis becomes even more intriguing when we consider what knowledge might have been lost when the civilization was destroyed. The Minoans were at the apex of Mediterranean civilization. They possessed advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and navigation. They had developed systems of writing, presumably including not just administrative records, but potentially philosophical and scientific texts. When their civilization was suddenly obliterated, when their ports were destroyed and their population decimated, much of that knowledge was lost forever. Some survivors escaped, carrying with them fragments of their culture, their stories, their memories of what had been. These survivors likely scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond, and their descendants preserved what they could remember about the lost civilization. Over generations, as the detailed memories faded, they became mythology. The technological marvels became magical powers. The sophisticated governance structures became heroic legends. The historical catastrophe became a morality tale about divine punishment for hubris. But underlying all these mythologized versions was a kernel of genuine historical memory, the memory of Atlantis. Plato, with access to Egyptian records and Greek genealogical traditions connecting him to these ancient sources, attempted to reconstruct and preserve what remained of this historical account. He was doing what he thought was important, recording genuine history before it disappeared entirely from human knowledge. This wasn't unusual for ancient scholars. They understood that civilization could collapse, that knowledge could be lost, and that preserving accounts from credible sources was a sacred responsibility. What secrets lie buried beneath the Mediterranean? What knowledge did Atlanteans possess that we've lost? Could exploring sunken cities and underwater structures finally reveal who truly inhabited these ancient lands and what they accomplished? With so many mysteries still hidden beneath the waves, with so much potentially recoverable knowledge resting on the ocean floor, one institution stands firmly between us and discovering the truth. Various governmental and academic bodies control what research gets funded, what areas get explored, what discoveries become public knowledge. They decide which findings support established historical narratives and which ones remain hidden or unreported. Looking closely at all the evidence we've explored, Plato's detailed account grounded in claimed historical sources, the geological reality of Santorini's cataclysmic eruption at exactly the right time, the Minoan civilization with its sophisticated technology and eventual destruction, the underwater structures awaiting investigation, the corroborating flood narratives from cultures worldwide, and the remarkable technological and architectural capabilities that exceed what we conventionally assign to ancient peoples, we're left with a powerful realization. The official version of history, dismissing Atlantis as pure fiction, becomes harder to defend with each new discovery. These findings suggest that Atlantis was likely real, that it referred to an actual historical civilization destroyed by geological catastrophe, that its memory was preserved in cultural narratives and written accounts, and that recovering its full story remains possible with dedicated archaeological investigation. While this idea might seem unusual to those trained in conventional historical thinking, each new piece of evidence makes it increasingly difficult to maintain that Atlantis was purely mythological. Perhaps the ancients knew far more than we credit them with, and their stories preserved genuine historical memories from which we have much to learn. But if these theories are so compelling, why does mainstream academia still resist exploring them fully? One reason is that accepting a real Atlantis would mean fundamentally rewriting everything we think we know about the development of human civilization. It would require acknowledging that advanced societies emerged and flourished far earlier than currently accepted timelines allow. It would mean conceding that entire civilizations, complete with sophisticated knowledge systems, were destroyed and largely forgotten. For many academics and institutions, admitting such profound gaps in our historical knowledge represents an existential threat to their credibility and authority. By carefully controlling which research gets funded, which sites get explored, and which discoveries become public knowledge, institutional gatekeepers have effectively positioned themselves as arbiters of historical truth, potentially silencing investigations capable of completely rewriting our understanding of human civilization. Imagine if we found unambiguous evidence buried beneath the Mediterranean of an advanced civilization from 12,000 years ago or even longer. Such a discovery wouldn't just change our view of the ancient Mediterranean. It could fundamentally alter our entire conception of human history, challenging everything we've assumed about our ancestors and their remarkable accomplishments. Standing at the brink of these profound mysteries, we must ask ourselves, will researchers finally receive the funding and permission to fully explore submerged cities and underwater archaeological sites, or will the secrets of Atlantis remain locked away beneath the waves? Will institutional resistance continue to prevent genuine investigation into alternative possibilities, or will academic courage prevail? For more ancient mysteries and hidden history, be sure to check out our other videos and subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the fascinating secrets that history still refuses to reveal. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, stay curious.